Welcome to The Kingdom Sleeps, the fantasy bedtime story decided by the roll of a dice. My name's Andrew, I'll be your story master for this evening.
And my name's Tom, I'll be playing the role of Yohm.
For those of you who aren't familiar with tabletop role-playing games, the concept is very simple. Tom and I will be improvising a story this evening, and occasionally we'll roll a dice to see where that story goes.
And for those of you who are familiar with DnD podcasts, if you're looking for something with just as much adventure and narrative, but maybe a little bit more chilled out to help you relax before bed, or indeed fall asleep, then we're hoping this might be the podcast for you.
The Kingdom Sleeps is set in the fantasy realm of Sopros, a vast continent that was formed over the back of a sleeping giant. The dreams of this colossus, known as the Mamu, roam the vast and otherworldly landscape and shape the lives and culture of the people that live there. If you'd like to hear more about the lore of Sopros, you can begin by listening to episode 0. So Tom, you play the character of Yohm, who of course lives in the world of Sopros, formed over the back of the sleeping colossus, this legend that exists within the world of Sopros. But people have different interpretations, different relationships to what has almost become the myth of the Colossus. Within this spectrum, where does Yohm sit, and what are his thoughts and experiences around the Colossus itself?
Much like a lot of Yohm's knowledge and learning, it comes from his upbringing as part of desert nomads, where they're very much a sort of an oral storytelling tradition sort of culture. So I heard a lot of fairy tales of the sleeping giant as he was growing up, and they were quite a romantic look on these sorts of things as well. Definitely not told as fact, but very common for most pharaohs of the desert to have heard stories about, you know, the breathing of the giant being the wind that shapes the dunes and whatnot. But I wouldn't say Yohm holds much, you know, realistic faith in that creation. He's not questioned it too much himself. So, yeah, a romantic idolization, I'd say, but not much more than that. But I think as the world's starting to change around him, he might be starting to reassess what he knows to be true. So, yeah, we'll see.
Certainly, Yohm may have cause to rethink what he believes. And with that, rest your head, close your eyes, as we join Yohm where the kingdom sleeps. So last we left Yohm. He was in the middle of an excursion into the Schwertsuna Desert with the young group of miners from the Harvesters Guild, and found himself in a situation having to rescue a young and rather arrogant miner, Kieran, who tried to somewhat naively face up to a huge, gigantic, and seemingly angered Mamu spirit, unlike any that Yohm had personally seen before in the Schwertsuna Desert. Kieran was quickly consumed by this spirit creature, and instructing the rest of the miners to flee, Yohm entered into the creature himself, and is in the process of looking for Kieran, having found that once he entered this serpent-like creature, inside was something quite unexpected. A different world, a dream-like world. An iridescent forest, huge, with looming pine trees and great foliage, weird and wonderful, varied flora. He also came to discover that things weren't quite as they seemed as he travelled through this forest landscape, finding he was able to pass through stones, finding different pockets of environments seemingly impossible to be next to each other. Great forests at one moment, crystal caverns at the next. And after having explored trepidatiously just for a while, having heard sounds of a whimpering creature perceivably trapped beneath the ground below his feet, having climbed high and seen creatures circling one another in a forest opening, led by some humanoid type creature off in the distant forest, Yohm decided to backtrack and take another path that was shown to him by the illuminating bright stone that seemed to be pointing to ways unseen. And so as he came down those crystal steps, passed through the rocky rubble, back into the forest opening, and towards the next cliff face, once again reaching out and his hand passing straight through it, he again finds he can step right through. And as he does so, feeling that strange chill over his body in the transition, now emerges in this almost glacier-like environment. There appears to be a soft, powdery snow beneath his feet, and the walls either side of him in this narrow passageway appear to glisten and undulate as if made of ice, all still with this iridescent, ethereal texture to it. And as he begins to walk down the path through this narrow passageway, bending slightly to the left, he's once again greeted with an opening and a sheer drop of around 15-20 feet below him. And as he stands above, looking down on this new area, this new opening, he can see a small circular enclosure with these crooked, almost jagged looking giant vine-like trees that create the circle of this opening and have small icy spikes that stick out. And running in the centre of this circular enclosure is a flowing river that shimmers and glistens and almost glows very slightly with a white blue light. And on the far side of the river, Yohm can see something, he's unsure what, stuck in between the edge of the riverbank and the river itself, with part of this material-like item flapping in the flowing water, almost as if it might get dragged away downstream at any moment. But as it stands, Yohm sits looking down with a sheer drop in front of him, about 15 to 20 feet.
Well, reflecting on his last incident with a relatively sheer drop, he kind of nurses his tender ankle once more and soaks in the atmosphere around him just for a moment. He's never seen snow before, but he's heard plenty about it from his old friend Wren. White sand, he used to call it. But never warm to the touch, always so cold. And to feel it with his fingers and see it with his own two eyes, to put into reality something which he'd only heard stories of before. It's just another strange step into this serpent and enlightening him to the world which he's just never seen. Keeps begging of the questions, wrapping around in his head. How has it come to be this way? How has anyone found this or survived in here before? Thinking of the mysterious figure. Thinking of the creature too, and the sound of flowing water that he heard not too long ago. And despite his best judgments telling him otherwise, he's going to have to find a way down. So he begins investigating once more, down to his hands, onto his knees, patting around the edge of this precipice and seeing if there's any safe way to descend at all.
So as Yohm gets down to his hands and knees and runs his arms along this sheer cliff face, he can once again see that although this cliff seems to be made of this icy, glossy kind of material, it seems to have similar engravings or etchings or natural formations in it that might allow him to get a hand or a foothold, although this time being a little bit more difficult due to the slippery nature of this ice. Although it would certainly be a difficult feat, especially given his previous fall. As he looks further around the edge of where he stands, there are strong, jutting out icicles and what seems to be mineral-like rock just on the precipice near his feet that perhaps a rope could be attached to, potentially.
He's going to have to try. I can't go back again. And yeah, it's been so many years since he's seen what could realistically be considered a body of water. So he'll need to get down there, no matter the cost. But nonetheless, he will try and hope to secure a rope to the most sturdy of outcroppings he could find, and hopefully prove to be a smoother descent than the last time.
So as Yohm grabs the rope from his bag and prepares as best he can, I'll get you to roll just once more for his success, as this will be a challenge.
That's an 8.
So as Yohm attempts to climb down, he's secured his rope quite well to one of the extruding spikes of mineral on the precipice above. But as he holds on tight to the rope and begins to secure his feet onto the edge of the cliff, he finds it just too slippery and is unable to have the dexterity needed, especially considering his ankle is already weak, to carefully lower himself down. And as such, he slides and falls, managing well enough to have the presence of mind to let go of the rope before he burns himself against it, but does land back with his head and back on the floor as he hits the powdery snow underneath him. Feels that hard, cold jolt.
Damn it to hell. He lays there for a second, just looking up above him in this sea of snow. And is the sky the same yellow glow as previous?
As Yohm looks up, he can see that it is once again this pale yellow sky that you can see just poking through the boughs of these crooked, spiky, tree-like plants that surround him.
Dusts himself off once more and clambers slowly to his feet. I think it's probably about now as well he retrieves that staff it's been sitting behind his backpack for a while now, and he's going to start leaning on that quite a bit more as he's going forward. Can't rely on his usual abilities like he'd like to, but nonetheless his determination's still strong. He wants to get down to that river. He wants to feel the flowing water on him just for a moment.
Sure thing. So as Yohm grabs his staff and begins to use it as a impromptu walking stick, it's not very long before he reaches this flowing body of water in front of him. He's only trudged a few paces through the snow. And so this body of water, perhaps 10 feet wide, flows in front of him. And it has this sparkling quality to it. It seems to, like I say, glow with this bluish, whitish light. And one of the first things Yohm will notice is that it's one of the first things he's noticed that has a fragrance to it. And it smells distinctly sharp, distinctly citrusy almost, in the way that bright stone will smell if you've had it in your hands for a long time and you smell your palms. It's a smell Yohm recognises in that way. And if he looks to his right, he'll see that the water seems to be rushing towards him from that direction. From through the dense, let's call them vine trees in this wintry forest. And you can just about make out that it seems to be coming from the inside of a cave, perhaps, but the entrance is very narrow. and very low. And if Yohm was going to enter it at all, he would not only have to combat the flow of water, but just about squeeze himself under this extremely narrow entrance and low to the ground entrance. To his left, you'll see that the water begins to flow towards this huge cliff face. It's like a stark mountain face that shoots up into the sky. If Yohm looks up, he can see these strange tropical-like plants that he would remember from having stood up high above the forest, having climbed the crystal steps. And then the water seems to once again run into this mountain via a very narrow, very low to the ground, cavey entrance. And then just in front of Yohm, he can see this item that he saw from up above, flapping in the water ever so slightly. This will be about 10 feet in front of him on the other side of this flowing water. And it looks distinctly like the capes that were worn by the youth of the Miners' Guild.
Yohm would approach the river, not stepping in it just yet, and getting as close as he can to this apparent piece of fabric to confirm what he's worrying. And then cast his eye downstream in the direction the water is flowing for any further signs of what might be Kieran's potential whereabout.
As Yohm takes a closer look at this piece of fabric, he can fairly accurately discern that this would have been Kieran's cape. Casting his eye downstream, there are no clear signs from where Yohm stands of Kieran or any of his items, though the stream does run down into this cliff face, maybe a good 50 feet away, so you might need to wander down along the bank of the river to investigate further if you wish.
No, just before he does that then, he's going to take the opportunity just to reach down and scoop up a palm of this water, this watery-like substance, and first of all just let it drip through his fingers, get that sensation once more and take in that scent. And as long as it isn't too foreboding, I suppose he'll just go straight in and take a hefty sip from a couple handfuls of water there. He's wondering if it is cold, if it's fresh.
So as Yohm kneels down, cupping his hands to bring this water to his mouth, the first thing he notices is that it is not cold. It has a warmth to it, almost like hot spring water, as it rests in his palms and radiates in his hands. And looking at sparkle, Yohm takes a sip and it tastes a little bit sharp, quite crisp, certainly not toxic in any way, quite nice, quite refreshing, and as it goes down his throat, he feels the warmth that it radiates in his hands fill his body, starting from his chest, radiating outwards, relaxing him, and Yohm will feel a sense of calm assuredness from having done this, and almost alleviates the confusion and bewilderment he feels from having been in this strange place. It almost feels a bit more like home.
And in doing so then, I imagine his, almost as if it were muscle memory, after taking that hearty sip himself, he'll take a couple more scoopfuls of that water, then slide his hand in between his scarf and his hood, and just gently start rubbing his neck, moistening it down a little bit, just alleviate some of the aggravation he gets around that area.
And as he begins to do this, he can feel the benefits almost immediately to his body as it begins to warm through his muscles and his shoulders, and some of the pain he felt before from his fall to the back begins to dissipate, and he feels more limber, more relaxed.
You'd have ever thought I'd miss water so much. And he looks left and right once more, yet again certain of where he needs to go. But that slight whimpering still echoing through his mind, the present problem of something seemingly needing help. It's always been a call he's been impossible to ignore. So I think he's going to try. He's going to try and scramble up, residing to himself that it doesn't matter if he fails, does it? At the end of the day, water always flows one way. So we might as well try. And if we slip, and if we stumble, if we splash around, it doesn't matter. At least we would have tried. So he begins packing up his gear a little bit more again and really securing it to himself, fastening up his clothes, putting in any loose accessories into his bag and tying it all together quite strongly, preparing himself to hopefully not go for a swim, but bracing himself to get quite wet nonetheless. And he'll try as best he can to make his way up the banks of this little river towards the opening in which the water is flowing from. And as he gets closer, he'll clamber up along the banks of this river as best he can and try to investigate this opening. And as long as it doesn't seem like almost certain death, I think he'd try to give it a go climbing on up.
So just to be sure, Yohm is going towards where the river is flowing from or to?
Flowing from.
So where the water seems to be coming from.
Yeah, with the reluctant acceptance that in the likely case he slips and falls again, ultimately he'll be still heading where he knows he needs to be.
So as Yohm follows along the bank of this flowing river into the dense forest of these jagged spiky, wintry trees. The foliage begins to get quite thick. This strange yellowish grass protrudes from the floor, almost like reeds next to the river that Yohm has to traverse through. Not difficult, but certainly more impeding than the terrain he was in before. And as he gets closer towards where the water appears to be flowing from, you can see now that the water is really gushing forward, almost in the form of rapids from the mouth of this very short and low entrance to the icy sort of cliff face that is in front of him. And as he gets towards this opening, he can go no further as he's stopped by just a huge looming cliff face in front of him that seems to shoot high up into the sky. It could be a good 200, 300 feet up. And there on the floor in front of him is the river, this short opening in this gushing torrent of water.
It's still emitting that same blue glow coming from within the opening as well, so it's not completely dark in there.
It's not completely dark. The glow is present, but it's not massively radiant. It doesn't illuminate too much, and through the whitewash of the flowing water, almost impossible to see inside.
Before taking the plunge, then, he's going to just let out a call once more up the cavern, listening for any echoes or response. Hello? Is anybody there? Do you need help? And just waits.
As Yohm waits, he hears the echo of his voice bounce back to him. But no reply comes.
Well, never one to turn back without trying. He steels himself once more and begins stepping into this river slowly, making sure he can find his footing. He's not trying to go anywhere just yet, as much as just be in there, feeling the strength of the water against him, trying to remember those sensations and how to easily work your way through an opposing force, feeling it sort of wrap around him. And then hopefully, as he becomes slightly more comfortable with that, he will then duck on down, minding his head and his surroundings, using all his appendages as best he can to secure himself in this low, small cave entrance, and tentatively try to push himself forward, all the time again preparing to quickly just drop and tuck and brace himself to be carried down the water should it need to go that way.
Well, as Yohm braces himself and tentatively begins to lower a leg into the water, he immediately notices the speed with which this water is rushing and the strength of the current. One of the first times as you say, he's been near water for a while, unusually so for a merfolk. So long, in fact, that he'd almost forgotten how in tune with the water his body is, and his relationship to water as one of the merfolk. So as he lowers his foot down into the water, not only does he feel it's rushing in the other direction and the strength of the flow, how difficult it will be for him to resist. He can feel the flow of the water in his body in an intuitive sense that all merfolk have, almost as if his body becomes part of it and can sense the path of the water, and suddenly he has a much deeper understanding of where this water goes and where it flows, and in his mind appears this map almost of the water. He can see where he stands, and he can feel the water flowing in the opposite direction to where he's trying to go. He can feel it rushing into the small gap, the entranceway into the cave on the opposite side. And he can feel it begin to pool in a little alcove somewhere beyond this cave. And then in front of him, just next to the cave entrance where the white rapids flow, he can feel the strength of the water, and he can feel this huge mass of water, or at least flowing water-like liquid from behind this cave entrance. And if he can manage to resist the current of the flow, he feels he's going to have to do some serious swimming to find an exit from this direction. So this all comes to him as he has just a foot and a calf in the flowing of the river.
Yeah, almost quite taken aback from those strangely nostalgic sensations. And, for someone who was born of these waters, he's still certainly not comfortable within them, despite this being a somewhat familiar feeling. It's a lot of strange paranoias and anxieties start bubbling up at the same time, as well as his relationship with the sea, and any amount of water whatsoever has been unfortunately linked with some troubles in his past. And as much as he longs to fight against the current and go further forward, he doesn't quite have the courage within him to know that he'll have to take a solid plunge and truly swim to see the other side. He's not quite ready for that yet. But whilst he still has this feeling within him, he's going to capture it while he can. And quicker than he's done anything in a while, he's essentially going to stand exactly where he would and just jump onto his back to a small pencil-like shape, with his bag held tightly across his chest. And he's going to do what he has always done and just go with the flow and let the water guide him to this a serene spot a little further down, and hope, almost pray to the water, that Kieran or some sign of his safety can be found there.
So as Yohm grabs tight onto his gear, onto himself, takes that plunge into the river, he suddenly feels that current grab him, and he's shot in the opposite direction, flowing down river way past where he walked, in the opposite direction. And as he does so, speeding forward, he feels himself run past that flapping piece of fabric that was laying in the river. Yohm gets caught up inside of it a little bit. And as he does so, this strange vision comes to Yohm. He becomes intertwined with Kieran's cloak. He sees Kieran on the opposite side of the river, just on the bank of the side where his cloak was, and he seems to be being carried upon the shoulders of these strange, almost crocodile-like Mamu creatures. These stocky, yellow, serpentine Mamu. Like I say, carrying Kieran on his shoulders, seemingly against his will, as Kieran begins to shout, "Where are you taking me? This is an outrage. Put me down this instant," as he begins to claw at the ground, and you watch as his cape gets left behind by the river as these Mamu creatures carry him away through the forest, just through a path on the opposite side of the river, just where the cloak lay before. As that all hits you in an instant, it flashes away as soon as it appears, and you find yourself once again flowing down this river. And as you continue travelling from the point of the cloak down and down towards this other cliff face and entrance, you bash up against the rocky side, finding that the entranceway in which the water flows is far too short and narrow for even perhaps a child to crawl through, let alone a full-grown person. But as you rest against the side of this cliff face, with either side of the bank of the river, to the left and right of you, in amongst the sound of the flowing water, you can once again hear, just through the crack where this water flows in to the mountain, that whimpering sound, that cry for help, that unsettled creature. And as you look over at the rock face, not dissimilar to the very first cliff face you came down and rolled your ankle, in that it has these strange, curling, spiralling symbols, all carved within it, going a full 200 feet into the air above you. But you can see that glowing yellow light beyond it, as if there's something inside this mountain. However which way you can enter it, there's a place within there where this creature in need sits.
Just sitting in the river for a moment with the water cascading upon his face, he mutters a little curse to himself. Kieran, when will you learn? Fool of a fate. But it does make his next decision ever so slightly easier. Since that somehow, despite the vision, that seems to make him think Kieran is okay. For some reason, still okay. And this reoccurring sound, that isn't. That is the more pressing problem. Reaching into his soul, it's really beginning to drone on him. It's why he keeps throwing caution to the wind. In this strange world, he's just chasing that sound. So I'll focus on that. He's going to climb on out of the water again and try and take a few steps back to get a better perspective on the whole of this cliff face, looking at this script or sculpture or whatever it may be adorning the sides of this. He's going to take a moment and see if he can put any logic to it. There's any interpretation that he might be able to muster, any recollection of any imagery of the past, just anything at all about these patterns on the walls.
So as Yohm begins to drag himself from the river, now sodden with this watery, glistening liquid, he's heavier than he was before, so it's some labour to drag himself out, but he manages to roll over onto the bank and drag himself onto his feet. Standing back and looking at this huge column of stone, like a mountain, but almost like a tower, though it is very broad, that juts into the sky. And as Yohm scans his eyes across these markings, they don't look like any form of language he recognizes. They look more like art, perhaps. In some of these strange shapes, he thinks he might be able to distinguish figures, perhaps the shapes of Mamu, perhaps the shapes of trees. It's so intertwined and intricate, however, that there's nothing quite distinct enough for him to interpret.
Do they bear any resemblance to the runes or the types of runes that he would have seen on Brightstone in the past?
They certainly share a similar curvature and geometry, the kinds of runes that Yohm will have seen on the Brightstone, especially the one that he holds in his hand, are very distinct. They are singular, specific, intentional shapes, and there are hints of this within these carvings he sees, but they also have more of a chaotic nature. Elements of them will seem specific, and then they'll trail off into curves and swirls.
He's thinking to himself, just the uncanny coincidence of this, the way in which the people of his world utilise magic through the bright stone, and it being so similar to what he's found here, with the smell of the water running through it and these runes being built onto the sediment and supposed different realities sat mere moments away from each other. And he's unfortunately not an academic enough of mind to really figure any of this out truly, but it's there, just brimming on the forefront of his mind, that there is something going on here. But nonetheless, that is a thought for another day or for a smarter man. And right now he needs to find the source of this crying. So if he looks around from what he can see, if the too small to enter opening is on one side, is there anything further round within eyesight on the edge of this cliff face? Any other openings or entrances or anything that would appear to indicate a way in?
So whilst Yohm stands in front of this huge column in front of him where the water is rushing, you can see that it is cylindrical in nature, and that perhaps if he were able to cross the river and continue walking around the side of this huge mountainous column, there might be other parts of it to explore. But casting his eye around what he can see at the moment, there appears to be no other entranceway, just solid, hard rock with these engravings. And immediately opposite him, where the river flows, is very, very dense. The clear path appears to be where in his vision he saw Kieran be taken. However, not impossible to traverse. It's just very thick with these high, jagged, vine-like trees, and may take a little more time. And of course, from where he stands, there's not necessarily an indication he'll come back round to the column if he takes the other path, so
he's going to have to trust whatever magic put this image into his mind then, and follow the path of hopefully least resistance for now, whilst always keeping an eye and an ear out for Kieran and his potential captors.
So Yohm heads back along the bank of the river, trudging through the powdery snow, back to the central enclosure where he first landed, now on the opposite side of the river. And he can quite clearly see this fairly narrow but distinct path through the icy forest. And as he begins to walk through it, he notices very sharply that the trees and the foliage and the ground beneath him begin to morph with his movements. And it's an almost more tropical environment. The chill begins to dissipate. It's replaced by a humidity and gentle drops of rain begin to fall. A liquid unlike the river he encountered before. This rain he can feel warm against his skin, but once again takes on no fragrance. The trees now much more like palm trees, and huge jungle foliage, big broad leaves bowing into his path. And now as he continues down this gully, he begins to hear what sounds like him to be the baying of drums, very low, boom, 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 boom. And as he gets closer and closer to this sound, he can just, through the foliage, begin to see what he believes to be the sight he witnessed high above the crystal caverns. He comes out onto this opening to see this circle of these Mamu creatures, these stocky little crocodile-like Mamu, dancing and undulating next to these small little bonfires they've lit. Some of them dancing away, some of them banging these drums now louder than before. Boom, boom, boom. And in the center, you can see this pile of rubble upon which has been fashioned some sort of throne of wood and vines and leaves. On either side of the throne sits these crocodile-like Mamu, almost as guards, and upon the throne sits young Kieran with this strange, almost serpentine-like vine around his neck that then wraps around his head, almost like a strange scarf, and you can see it so long that it trails around his head, around his neck, off his shoulder, off the throne, and then off into the forest. But it sits over him, draped over him, and he sits waving his arms in the air to their dancing, with a grin on his face, a very self-satisfied grin, almost as if he's conducting the dancing itself. You can just about see all this off on the edge of the forest, and you've just tucked yourself behind a broad tree trunk, so no one's quite seen Yohm yet. What would he do in this instance?
After getting over the shock of it all, seeing that Kieran is indeed alive, he'd try and get a fix on Kieran's state of well-being, I suppose. This place is a strange one, and it's taken quite the toll on Yohm so far. If it could at all be achieved via a glance, he'd try and see if he was all there, if he was present in this moment, or if something else was potentially controlling him.
From where Yohm sits, from his knowledge of people, from his knowledge of Kieran, albeit very little, he can see quite plainly that his manner is certainly different to how he experienced it before. Kieran was an arrogant young man but he held himself with some semblance of decorum, some stiff, stubborn pride he held in himself. But this smile that Yohm sees on his face, the way he waves his hands around, there's a hint of mania to it. There's a sense he's almost drunk, could be. Certain inhibitions seem to be fled from him.
Thought that might be the case. Roughly, how many Mamu are in this opening surrounding him that I can see at a glance once more?
You can see distinctly that there are 5 Mamu dancing around this throne in a pentagonal formation. And there are 2 Mamu either side of the throne, so that's 7 of these crocodile-like creatures in total.
And then finally past, if I could see that far, past the opening. Yeah, the path that led us here, does there seem to be another one leading away? Or is this the terminus of the route so far?
It seems to be the terminus of the route so far to you. The only other potential route Yohm might see is wherever it is that this long sort of serpentine slinky vine of sorts, I suppose, that wraps itself around Kieran's head and neck seems to trail off into the forest on the opposite side. There's definitely something in that direction, it would seem, though there is no obvious path.
And then, would Yohm suspect one of these Mamu could potentially fit through the river cave opening that he was too big to? Or is it too small for even them?
Looking at them, it appears to be perhaps even too small for them. These are about half the size of Yohm, these creatures, and it might take something a little bit smaller to get through.
Well then, piecing together what he could so far from this distance, and still no obvious alternative solution, he's going to creep slowly and quietly closer and try and find a path, if at all possible, to signal Kieran of some regard, if it's just to make eye contact at least whilst trying to avoid the glare of the Mamu. If there's any way at all he can position himself or find an opening to maybe throw a twig or something of the sort away from the other eyes.
So just to be clear, you're trying to attract the attention of Kieran specifically without alerting any of the Mamu. Certainly. Yohm will see quite clearly that there is a small and quite discreet path that will allow him to get slightly closer towards where Kieran sits. And if he moves himself in that direction, he'll notice that any sort of attempt to wave over at Kieran or gently whistle in his direction is not heeded, as his eyes sort of obsessively glare around at the dancers. but Yohm can certainly see a few bits of foliage, a few twigs on the floor, a few stones on the ground that, if he should so choose, would be suitable to throw in his direction to grab his attention.
Pausing for thought for a moment before committing to alarming Kieran or the Mamu around him, and just reflecting quickly on the giant serpent which swallowed the two of them to begin with. Distinctly remembered black eyes, which was, if I'm not mistaken, unusual for Mamu. Can he see anything similar in these?
In the eyes of these Mamu, he certainly can. All the Mamu around him that dance, and each one by Kieran's side, have these inky black eyes, much like those Yohm saw before entering. And if he stares hard enough at Kieran, though he's a bit further away and his eyes are a little smaller, you could almost swear that his eyes were an inky black as well.
From where we're at now then, is there a chance Yohm thinks he could get to that vine that is attached to Kieran and slinking off somewhere? Is there a way he can somewhat skirt the perimeter and get to where that vine might be without alerting anyone else, or will that be right in the eye of everyone?
He could certainly get to the vine without having to cross the path of these Mamu. However, he'll have to traverse the full scale of the circular enclosure, which will require a little bit of stealth that might become a little difficult to Yohm in his current state. So if you'd like to attempt that, I'll get Yohm to roll for it.
Always deliberating in one mind. If I sneak round, I might be able to get to the vine and figure out what that's doing to Kieran. But if they spot me, well, it's just like 5 of that giant serpent on one. No open out. And that darkness, it's plaguing all their minds. He looks down at that stone in his hand again. Illuminate the darkness, he says. Oh, Ren, what should I do? And he decides, in this moment, not too sure why, but he gives up any pretense of stealth and subterfuge, and sneaking and slinking around. Again, something about these creatures just feels wrong to him on a very deep level, and it's something he just cannot ignore. So instead, right where he stands, brings himself up tall, and he just holds that stone aloft his head, with the words of his friend echoing in him. And he just speaks out quietly. He doesn't even yell it. He knows what's about to happen nonetheless. Kieran, please, come and see the light. And he hopes so much that this magic stone has helped him out quite a lot so far. It helps him out once more and does something to bring these Mamu back to the joyful little creatures he knows they can be.
So as Yohm stands there, at the edge of this enclosure, looking upon this scene, holding the bright stone tight, raising it aloft his head, and whispering these words gently, the stone begins to glow, that warm glow, and you can see that this tendril, this vine that wraps itself around Kieran's head and neck, begins to glow bright white. And just for a second, you see Kieran's hands begin to stop gesticulating and come to his side. In what seems like a small moment of clarity, and this tendril of bright whiteness, you can now see its clear path into the forest, and you can, much like you saw this glowing yellow light before, beneath you, you can see the clear path of this tendril, almost like a heat map that leads through the forest all the way towards this large stone mountainous column that you came from before, that just sits in the distance behind the forest edge, almost as if it seems to be connected to that glowing yellow presence that you saw before. And as you see Kieran's hands come down to his side, you see him, almost dazzled, begin to look away from the dancing Mamu, and then in your direction. And he says, in a firm, clear voice, "Yohm, you've arrived."